invitation today, an opportunity to share my work at the Research Roundup. Kind of one of those long-time listeners, first-time speakers sort of situations. I'd also like to thank everyone that's listening in today for their interest. Hope wherever you are, you're staying safe and doing well. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of my PhD work investigating the nesting ecology of ducks in the boreal forest. I completed this work over the past 5 years at the University of Waterloo under the supervision of my supervisor, Dr. Brad Fady, and with my co-author at DUC, Dr. Stuart Slattery. The boreal forest is the second most productive breeding area for ducks in North America, producing 12 to 15 million ducks annually. We've known this region is important to waterfowl production for a long time, as evidenced from historic maps from More Game Birds in America Foundation, the predecessor to Ducks Unlimited, who identified the boreal as one of the most important areas where duck restoration dollars will produce the most ducks. However, we have limited empirical data for ducks from Canada's boreal forest, potentially because of the remote and inaccessible nature of the region, earning it the title of no man's land on this early Ducks Unlimited map. This is of concern because the habitat is different from the prairies, the community of predators is different, and land use change could be fundamentally altering interactions between ducks and their predators in this region. In Alberta, most of you are likely familiar with the Athabasca oil sands in association with oil and gas development. However, the majority of development in the province occurs as in situ mining in the boreal forest, which requires infrastructure including roads, pipelines, seismic lines, and well pads, as can be seen on the right image here. This infrastructure represents an industrial footprint 50 times larger than the mining zone and has produced a variegated landscape that includes intensive local disturbance coupled with extensive landscape disturbance. The majority of research in this region is focused on large mammals, and in particular wolves and caribou. In short, increasing moose and white-tailed deer populations have resulted in a numeric response by wolves in the boreal forest as a function of abundant resources. In addition, wolves have been found to use industrial linear features like roads, seismic lines, and pipelines to move faster and farther across the landscape. As a result, previous spatial segregation between wolves and caribou has been reduced, facilitated by industrial disturbance, increasing predation of caribou by wolves as a function of apparent competition. More recently, other predator species like black bears and coyotes have also been found to increase their use of landscapes with industrial development. However, there's limited information on how this development affects other prey species in this region, like migratory birds, and particularly for ducks. For ducks, the selection of a nest site is an important decision because predation is the primary cause of nest failure. Therefore, there's strong selective pressure to choose a safe nest site. In addition, ducks must balance current versus future reproductive trade-offs given the potential of the incubating adult to be eaten during incubation in addition to the eggs. Therefore, if industrial development is having a negative effect on boreal ducks, we expect to be able to detect these effects through investigation of their nesting ecology. The overall goal of my dissertation was to understand how industrial development affects the nesting ecology of boreal ducks. To achieve that goal, we asked a few simple questions. Where do ducks nest? How many get eaten? What eats them? And where are the predators? Our study area was near Uticuma Lake, Alberta, which is about 100 kilometers north of the town of Slave Lake in Canada's Boreal Plains ecozone and Alberta's boreal forest natural subregion. We selected study sites based on a hierarchy of criteria related to industrial development intensity, predicted waterfowl density, and accessibility. We also excluded sites from areas that had recently burned or been logged to reduce the potential of confounding effects. We had a total of 16 sites in 2016, 24 in 2017, and 25 in 2018. My chapters are all based on data collected using the following general field approach. At our study sites, we searched for nests in groups of 3 to 6 by systematically searching around wetland edges and potential nesting habitat. We searched each site at least twice per season starting in early May, and each search was separated by at least 15 days. When we found a nest, we identified the species and estimated the nest age by candling and floating eggs. We then monitored nests every 7 to 10 days to determine their fate and collect relevant nest habitat measurements at the estimated hatch date to reduce disturbance at an active nest. We also used artificial nests each year at a subset of our sites to help identify potential nest predators of ducks in the region, and we used camera traps on real and artificial nests to identify and detect nest predators. Finally, in addition to determining who the predators were, we were also interested in where they were, so we used trail cameras at each site to detect associations between predator occurrence and landscape features. My first chapter investigated microhabitat nest site selection by ducks in the boreal forest and was published in 2019 in the Journal of Field Ornithology. In this chapter, we used data from nests we located while nest searching to understand what components of vegetation structure and composition are important to boreal ducks as part one of our answer to the question of where do ducks nest. We measured vegetation at the estimated hatch date at every nest we located via nest searching and a paired random location. We estimated vegetation structure with overhead and lateral cover estimates, as well as vegetation composition by identifying the species present within 1 meter of the nest bowl and estimating their canopy cover and average height. We located a total of 165 nests from 2016 to 2018, of which 134 were of upland or ground nesting ducks and 31 were of overwater nesting ducks. We used conditional logistic regression to compare nest sites to their respective paired random locations. We developed a global model that included all variables of interest related to structure and composition for all species combined between nesting guilds and for each species. We then evaluated all combinations of our global model to select the top-ranked model as determined by AIC. We found partial support for the nest concealment hypothesis because Boreal ducks consistently selected for greater overhead cover than was available. However, we found that most ducks selected lateral cover in proportion to its availability, with the exception of blue-winged teal that selected nest sites with less lateral cover than was available. We suspect that overhead cover provides cover from nest predators like common ravens and can also provide cover for the attending female entering and exiting the nest, as well as thermoregulatory cover during incubation. We predicted that lateral cover would be greater at nest sites, but suspect our results highlight the additional consideration of detecting an incoming predator, where attending hens must trade off between current and future reproduction. We also found that the composition of vegetation at the nest site varied by species and suggests that this facilitates coexistence of multiple species in this region. For example, mallards and American widgeons selected greater shrub cover at nests relative to what was available, while ring-necked ducks avoided shrub cover. We also observed some structural variation between teal species, with blue-winged teal selecting nest sites with shorter vegetation and green-winged teal selecting nest sites with taller vegetation. Our results of species-specific nest site preferences are largely consistent with previous descriptions from other regions for these species. Variation in microhabitat nest site characteristics between nesting guilds and species is consistent with a strategy to maximize space differentiation between coexisting species through resource partitioning. This broad niche space likely limits predation and reduces queue formation by predators. Lower nesting densities and different predator communities in the boreal forest compared to the prairies may result in a different strategy of nest site selection. It's also consistent with the potential prey site hypothesis, where vacant spaces or potential nest sites reduce search efficiency by predators. However, the infiltration of novel predators in association with development with different nest search strategies or biotic homogenization of vegetation as a result of development and climate change could threaten boreal ducks. While microhabitat net selection provides us insight into characteristics at the nest site itself, management and conservation efforts often occur at much larger spatial scales. Therefore, in Chapter 3, we investigated multiscale nest site selection of ducks in the western boreal forest of Alberta. This chapter is currently in review at Landscape Ecology and is part 2 to our answer of where do ducks nest. In this chapter, we evaluated how ducks selected nest sites in association with what was available to them within their hypothetical home range, or third order of selection. Importantly, within this order, how you quantify a variable of interest is of great importance into what inference you can make. Therefore, we quantified variables of interest at multiple spatial scales to understand where ducks were placing their nests compared to land cover and land use variables related to oil and gas development. For this chapter, we limited our analysis to just upland or ground nesting ducks. We made this decision because at greater spatial scales, there's less variability across nest sites from our limited sample size, which would limit the power we have to detect differences between nesting guilds or among species. Therefore, our sample size for this analysis was 134 nests of 6 species. The nests were located across our study area, and we had representative nests from study sites of all levels of development. However, we did not find nests at every site that we searched. Quantified our variables of interest related to land use and land cover using remote sensing data in R. We derived land use variables based on the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute's human footprint inventory of the 2016 vintage, and our land cover data was from Ducks Unlimited Canada's enhanced wetland cover layer. As an example, the industrial features we evaluated included roads, which are broken up into primary and secondary roads. Primary roads consisted of paved or gravel roads, while secondary roads were abandoned roads or trails. We also looked at wells and included active and inactive wells together, industrial features such as pumping stations or facilities, borrow pits, which are used to borrow substrate to produce roads or well pads and can fill with water in areas where the water table is close to the surface. We also included pipelines, which are used to transport oil and gas between wells and to pumping stations, and finally seismic lines, which are used for exploration. Overall, we predicted that these industrial features would be avoided. In addition to land use, we also considered variables related to land cover and assumed that wetland variables would be selected, while forest and open water would likely be avoided. In addition to considering land use and land cover variables, it's important to consider how these variables are measured at multiple spatial scales. Altering the scale changes the definition of the variable or how it might be perceived by the duck. Altering the scale captures the ecological context because animals generally perceive habitat patches and not points. Therefore, this approach inherently captures patch size and heterogeneity. For example, if you consider this hypothetical landscape where a duck might nest, the amount of habitat we might quantify as used depends on how we define the scale or size of our buffer that quantifies the habitat. And as we increase the buffer size, we increase the landscape context under consideration of used. Therefore, for this work, we considered 6 spatial scales consistent with species biology and management. We used weighted logistic regression to develop multigrain resource selection functions. First, we pseudo-optimized the most predictive scale for each variable using univariate models and selected the top-ranked spatial scale with AIC for each variable of interest. On the y-axis, we have the selection coefficient estimate and associated 85% confidence interval. On the x-axis are the moving window sizes, with each variable represented in an individual window. We observed variation in the best spatial scale across variables of interest, highlighting the importance of incorporating scale into our approach. For example, marsh habitat was selected across all spatial scales considered. However, the greatest magnitude of selection was observed at the 300-meter scale. In contrast for open water habitat, we observed use in proportion to availability at scales under 1,000 meters, followed by avoidance at coarser spatial scales. For Boreal pits, we observed selection at fine spatial scales, flipping to avoidance at the coarsest spatial scale. And for seismic lines, we detected avoidance at fine spatial scales and use in proportion to availability at coarser spatial scales. We then moved the top-ranked scale for each variable into an additive modeling framework where we considered all combinations of the global model and used AIC to select the best model. Our best model explaining nest site selection for ducks highlights the importance of marshland cover for nesting, where probability of selection for a nest site greatly increases with the proportion of marsh within 300 meters of a nest. We suspect that marsh habitat surrounding nests likely suggests access to foraging and brood-rearing habitat. We observed other predictive land cover variables, but for today, I just want to highlight the importance of marsh given the magnitude of its effect. For industrial development, we observed the strongest response to industrial features for Boreal pits, where ducks had an increased probability of nesting in association with greater proportion of Boreal pits within 300 meters of a nest. Boreal pits are often associated with grassy buffers that are attractive to nesting ducks and may provide additional nesting habitat. We also observed a positive effect of primary and secondary roads on nest site selection, which has also been shown in the prairies and from elsewhere in the breeding range of ducks. Finally, we found that ducks avoided nesting in habitats with increasing densities of pipelines and seismic lines within 300 meters of a nest. This observation is consistent with a pattern observed by Howie Singer and colleagues, where population trends of upland nesting ducks declined in areas of greater seismic density. Predators are using these features as travel corridors and occurring at higher densities in these areas, then ducks may be avoiding them when selecting nest sites. We then developed a predictive map from our best model that can be used as a tool by managers and planners to prioritize areas for conservation efforts in the region most likely to protect important nesting habitat for ducks. We also predicted the associated error in our model, which can help managers visualize the uncertainty in our predictions to help inform decisions. Next, we wanted to assess the consequences of nest site selection strategies to survival and answer the question of how many nests get eaten. This forms Chapter 4 of my research titled Duck Nest Survival in the Western Boreal Forest, which has been submitted to the journal formerly known as the Condor, Ornithological Applications. Hens should choose safe nest sites that increase survival. Therefore, we predicted that traits selected during nest site selection should have a positive effect on nest survival, while resources that were avoided should have a negative effect on nest survival. However, if traits that are selected have a negative effect on survival, then these decisions are maladaptive or can create an ecological trap. And we were interested if industrial development in the boreal forest was creating ecological traps for ducks. We used the same data from the first 2 chapters to answer this question. However, we only included nests that were successful or depredated in our sample. We used the logistic exposure model and a 2-stage modeling approach where we first built a model to account for nest characteristics not captured by our micro or macrohabitat variables previously investigated, and then we moved that model forward as a fixed base model to produce the best model that explained nest survival at the micro and macrohabitat level. Overall, we found that nest survival was low, but did not find any variation among species. We observed annual variation in nest survival and increased survival for nests that were found later in incubation. Generally, older nests should have a higher probability of hatching, and nest defense should increase with age, so this result was unsurprising. Previous studies have also shown how annual environmental conditions can vary for water availability, temperature, or variation in predator populations, which we suspect is what is being captured here with this result. For microhabitat variables, we would expect that ducks attempt to maximize concealment to avoid predator detection, and our results are consistent with that idea because survival increased for nests with vegetative cover. Interestingly, we previously found ducks in the study appeared to avoid forb cover when selecting nests. From our results, it appears that hens need to trade off to find optimal cover that likely provides concealment of the nest, but also the ability to detect incoming predators. For our macrohabitat models, we performed a similar pseudo-optimization approach to select the best scale, holding the baseline model constant for each variable and scale tested. For most variables, confidence intervals overlap 0 across spatial scales, and the majority of scales tested for each variable were within 3 AIC scores, suggesting some model uncertainty in our scale selection. For macrohabitat variables, we did not detect any negative effects of industrial development on nest survival, suggesting that the current level of development is not having any negative demographic consequences on nesting ducks. We observed nest survival to increase with increasing densities of pipelines and primary and secondary roads. We previously have shown that roads were selected, suggesting that nesting in proximity to roads might be adaptive. These results are consistent with research from elsewhere in North America investigating industrial effects on nest survival. We suspect that roads may create refugia for prey if predators avoid roads, potentially due to human presence or presence of other competitors. We also observed greater survival for nests with higher densities of pipelines within 90 meters, which was opposite our prediction based on our unobserved avoidance. Here, the scale of effect was at 90 meters, while for avoidance it was at 300 meters, which may explain the opposite trend. However, it might also indicate a nonlinear response to pipelines. In our study area, pipelines are often wider than other anthropogenic linear features like seismic lines and might be more similar to roads due to the fact that the vegetation is often maintained on these features, or they are used as travel corridors for oil and gas service and monitoring, possibly providing a similar refugia effect. One reason we may not have found more non-zero relationships in association with nest survival is because of the adaptive peak hypothesis and the relationship between nest site selection and survival. If ducks are already avoiding high-risk habitats through the selection of a nest site, there might not be enough natural variation between successful and unsuccessful nests to detect an effect, which will further be influenced by our low sample size. Therefore, evaluating these two processes consecutively is important for understanding nesting ecology. For example, while we did not detect any negative effects of development on nest survival, we did find that ducks avoided industrial features when selecting a nest site. As a result, our predictive maps from our nest site selection analysis can be used to identify priority areas for conservation efforts. Because nesting is such an important stage in life for ducks and predation is the most common cause of nest failure, as evidenced in our previous chapter, in Chapter 5 we identified the important nest predators from a sample of real and artificial nests that were monitored with camera traps. This work, titled Nest Predators of Ducks in the Boreal Forest, was published in August in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. We identified 8 total predator species that depredated real or artificial nests or hens. At real nests, the most common predator were species of the genus Mustela, which included ermine and least weasel, which were difficult to differentiate in images, so we just grouped them together. However, we also identified coyotes, American black bears, Canada lynx, common ravens, and red-tailed hawks as nest predators. Artificial nests, we identified many of the same predators responsible for depredation of real nests, with the exception of an American martin and red squirrels as additional predators, and no evidence of lynx or red-tailed hawks at artificial nests. Here in panel A, we can even see some bear cubs are getting in on the action, which, just have to show some of the warm, cuddly critters of the boreal forest. Primary mammalian predators we identified are different from common prairie nest predators, including skunks, raccoons, and foxes, which suggests that management and conservation efforts require different strategies if we were to attempt to reduce nest predation. If we consider only real nests, we did not identify any individual species responsible for the majority of nest predation, in contrast to the prairies where 1 or 2 species often dominate. We think this might reflect the low nest densities and that ducks are an opportunistic prey item in the boreal that would produce inefficient search efforts for many predator species. Overall, this work provides new information by identifying the predators of boreal ducks. However, the question still remains about how predators and nesting ducks overlap in space and the role of industrial development in shaping that relationship. Therefore, in Chapter 6, my final data chapter, We use data collected from camera traps from the sites we nest search to understand the associations of land cover and land use on the space use of terrestrial mammals. We were interested in understanding if the industrial footprint influenced predator habitat use in our study area to understand if ducks nesting in areas with greater industrial footprint might be at a greater risk of predation. To do this, we placed at least 2 Reconyx PC900 hyperfire cameras at sites annually along high probability wildlife use areas and used scent lure to increase detection probability. We monitored camera traps consistent with nest searching and monitoring efforts. We used multiscale occupancy modeling in a single season, single species approach Sensu Nichols 2008, using the package R presence to account for our study design of multiple cameras per site to account for the lack of independence between camera traps. We developed independent models for predators and prey as a functional group and species-specific models, but today I just want to focus on the predators. Because we did not assume closure between occasions, we interpret our estimates to represent habitat use and not occupancy. For predators, which included black bear, gray wolf, coyote, and lynx, we found a common trend of increasing detection probability at cameras surrounded with a greater amount of industrial footprint. However, lynx did not appear to respond to industrial footprint. We also found a greater probability of detection at cameras with lure for black bear and lynx, but found lower detection for wolves. Finally, we observed higher rates of detection for both wolves and coyotes for cameras that were on linear features as opposed to on wildlife trails. Overall, we interpret this evidence of greater detection associated with industrial footprint, greater activity with less industrial footprint. We also found support for greater use of industrial footprint areas for coyotes, but habitat use was best explained for other predator species by Landcover variables. Increased detection probabilities in areas with more disturbance might indicate a behavioral shift where predators are more active in areas with greater footprint, making it more difficult for prey to avoid predators and increasing predation risk through increased prey encounters. Taken in consideration with our identification of duck nest predators, continued industrial development may have the potential to result in increased nest predation from coyotes and bears if increased activity results in higher rates of predation for ducks. Our results are consistent with other studies in the boreal forest indicating changing space use as a response to industrial development and warrants continued attention in the context of important nest predators of ducks. Now I just provided this slide to give both myself and yourself a chance to breathe. And I know that was a lot to cover, so let's quickly review with some of the highlights. So we wanted to understand how industrial development affects the nesting ecology of boreal ducks. To do that, we first asked where do ducks nest, and we found that boreal ducks selected nest sites with greater overhead cover and that vegetation composition varied among species, which likely facilitates coexistence. Next, we used multigrain resource selection functions to show that ducks like marsh, roads, and borrow pits, but appear to avoid pipelines and seismic lines while nesting. We then predicted that model across space to help conservation managers and planners to prioritize habitat conservation in areas that are important for nesting ducks. Next, we investigated how many nests survive and found that nest survival was relatively low in the boreal forest, and we did not detect any negative effects of industrial development on nest success. We also found that multiple species, including black bears and Canada lynx, were important nest predators of boreal ducks, but that no single species was primarily responsible for the majority of nest predation, potentially related to the low nesting densities in the boreal forest. And finally, we confirmed that industrial development be affecting the distribution of predators by possibly increasing the activity of important nest predators like coyotes and bears. Together, this work produced multiple lines of evidence to help improve our understanding of boreal duck ecology and provides a foundation for necessary future work in the important breeding area that is expected to face continued expansion of the industrial footprint. In summary, there does not appear to be any current negative demographic effects of industrial development on boreal ducks during nesting. However, we did detect altered selection decisions, suggesting that ducks may be resilient to current levels of development. Immediate conservation efforts should likely focus on conserving marsh habitat in the boreal forest to benefit nesting ducks, particularly in areas with low densities of seismic lines. Importantly, we identified nest predators of ducks and found that industrial development alters those species' space use, underscoring the potential for time-lagged responses to predator communities down the road or the potential of predation responses to manifest at a different vital rate. For example, the survival of ducklings during the brood-rearing period could limit population growth and is yet to be evaluated in the boreal forest. Overall, this work provides a start, but a greater number of nests and evidence from a broader spatial area and over time in the boreal is needed to further test our conclusions and answer additional questions relevant to boreal waterfowl ecology. There's no substitute for the value of long-term research studies to investigating complex ecological questions, and the future of wildlife in the boreal forest certainly constitutes a complex challenge. Continued efforts to improve our understanding of species ecology and community responses that affect the distribution and abundance of wildlife in the boreal forest are urgently needed to maintain healthy wildlife populations. With that, a special shout out and acknowledgement to all the technicians that work tirelessly to help collect this data. And I'd also like to thank the organizations that made this work possible: Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Waterfowl Research Foundation, Wildlife Habitat Canada, the Alberta North American Waterfowl Management Plan, Alberta Conservation Association, MyTax, and Ontario Graduate Scholarships. Look forward to some of the questions, and you can also get in touch with me on Twitter or by email listed at the bottom of the screen. Thanks very much for your time, and happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Great presentation. All right, if anybody has any questions for Matt, feel free to type them into the chat box. Again, if you can't find it, just hover over the cartoon bubble and you can type in your questions, and we'll see what Matt has to say. Well, Matt, not that I'm a waterfowl scientist, but did you the years that you were looking at with precipitation, were some years drier and were some years wetter, and does that have an effect on the ability for hens to hide in the canopy at all, or affect the predator populations?
Yeah, Brian. So we didn't specifically look at precipitation per se, and I think that some of those environmental variables might be important to look at. There's a lot of variation spatially, so I think we'd need some some better data that's at a smaller spatial scale than some of the broader stuff that's available. But I think that over longer term, I think that precipitation definitely plays a role there, particularly in association with how it relates to some beaver damming and beaver activity in areas.
Okay, we have a question from Howie Singer. A great presentation. Can you elaborate more on the results suggesting ducks selecting nesting sites closer to burrow pits and burrow pits prevalence throughout the landscape you searched?
Yeah, definitely, Howie. I haven't looked at more broadly across Alberta to see what the distribution looks like specifically, but burrow pits in this landscape are very common. We kind of have them everywhere. In the picture that I have up on the screen, just off to the right of the well pad there, you can kind of see what one of those might look like in terms of areas where they just kind of dig out beside the road to provide some substrate. These often end up having some grassy edges around them, and you almost always see ducks on them when you're driving around throughout the boreal forest. And so I think that they provide some important nest habitat that potentially are more analogous to some of the potholes that some of these species might be used to seeing in the prairies. So I think that might be something that's going on there.
Okay, so it seems that there's no more questions, and we are hitting the top of the hour here, and we do want to be punctual. So we will wrap it up there. But I just want to say one more thanks to Sarah and Matt for the presentations. Oh, we got one question here from Stuart. We have a couple more minutes. What do you make of the lower nest success associated with fens?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So in terms of the lower nest success with fens, I think in this case, a lot of these we have more open habitat, and so potentially some of the avian predators, I think might, like common ravens, may be able to observe hens more often, and so that could potentially be what's going on there. But yeah, still trying to make a little bit more sense of that for sure. But that's my initial hypothesis for what's going on there.
Okay, great. All right, well, we will wrap it up here. Again, thanks to Sarah and Matt for the presentations, and thanks to everyone for logging in and taking the time out of your day to be part of our webinar. We always hope you find it of interest. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, February 4th in 2021 in the new year. So just keep your eye open for that communication coming your way. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and have a great day. Bye for now.